The constable left Bramble Cottage at 6:30, just as the autumn dusk was settling over the village like a grey woolen blanket, and Miss Marple remained in Eleanor's sitting room long after his departure, sitting in the gathering darkness with only the faint glow from the dying fire to illuminate her thoughtful expression. She had politely declined his suggestion that she leave the house, insisting instead on remaining to ensure that nothing was disturbed before the proper investigation could commence in the morning, though both she and Sergeant Morris understood that propriety and procedure had little to do with her actual intentions. When the constable's footsteps had faded into the distance, she rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had begun to protest the passage of time, and she began to move through Eleanor's cottage with the methodical precision of a woman conducting an inventory not of objects but of meanings. The sitting room revealed nothing unusual, books neatly arranged on their shelves, a needlework project laid carefully on the side table with a bookmark indicating Eleanor's progress through a particularly complex Fair Isle pattern, the wireless set positioned so that Eleanor could listen to her evening programs while occupied with her knitting. Miss Marple noted these things with the part of her mind that catalogued the ordinary, while another, deeper part of her consciousness registered the absence of anything that might suggest upheaval or distress. The kitchen, when she moved into it, presented a similar picture of undisturbed routine. The keys lay exactly where the constable had found them, arranged in a neat line beside Eleanor's spectacles, and Miss Marple observed with interest that they were arranged not as one might casually set them down, but rather in a deliberate pattern, almost as if Eleanor had placed them there with conscious intention, as if she had been saying something through their arrangement. The back door stood open to the garden, admitting the cool evening air and the faint sounds of the village settling into night, and it was here that Miss Marple spent considerable time, examining the lock mechanism, the hinges, and the surrounding area with an intensity that might have seemed peculiar to any observer. The door had not been forced. Of that much she was absolutely certain, nor had it been left carelessly ajar. The latch was of the sort that required one to pull the door closed and turn the key in order to secure it properly, the type of mechanism that would not allow a door to remain open unless deliberately propped or left unfastened from within. This suggested to Miss Marple that Eleanor had departed through that door with full knowledge of what she was doing, that the open door was not an accident, but rather a deliberate choice, a signal perhaps, or simply the careless action of someone whose mind was occupied with matters of considerably greater importance than the security of her home. The garden itself, when Miss Marple ventured out into the gathering darkness, proved to be a revelation of a different sort. Eleanor's roses, which had been her pride and her primary occupation for the past 4 decades, were in an advanced state of autumn decline. The blooms past their prime, the foliage beginning to brown at the edges. Yet among this gentle decay, Miss Marple observed signs of recent disturbance, a section of the garden where several plants had been uprooted or trampled, earth scattered across the path as if someone had been digging or moving about with considerable urgency. She found herself drawn to the area near the garden wall, the place where the wool scarf had been draped across the iron rail, and as she ran her fingers along the rough stone, she observed marks that suggested the wall had recently been climbed, scratches on the surface that spoke of hands gripping the ancient blocks, feet seeking purchase on its weathered surface. By the time Miss Marple returned to the cottage, full darkness had descended, and she spent some hours in Eleanor's bedroom, examining the wardrobe with the careful attention of someone reading an autobiography written in fabric and thread. Eleanor's clothes were consistent with the woman Miss Marple knew, practical garments in muted colors, well made and carefully maintained, nothing that suggested excess or vanity, yet nothing that suggested the neglect or lack of self-regard that sometimes accompanied advanced age. In the bottom drawer of Eleanor's dresser, hidden beneath a pile of winter stockings, Miss Marple discovered a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Eleanor's careful handwriting, documenting events and feelings with a precision and honesty that suggested these pages had been written for an audience of one. She did not read the journal that night. That would have felt like a violation of the trust that had bound her and Eleanor together across 5 decades of friendship. But she noted its existence, its location, and the fact that Eleanor clearly maintained a record of thoughts and observations that she shared with no one. It was past midnight when Miss Marple finally locked the cottage behind her and made her way through the dark streets toward her own home. And as she walked, her mind was working through possibilities and implications, arranging facts and observations into patterns that the official investigation had not yet begun to consider. By the time she reached her own doorstep, she had begun to form a preliminary theory about Eleanor's disappearance, though it was a theory that raised far more questions than it answered, and that depended upon assumptions about human motivation that would require careful consideration. The wool scarf on the fence, the keys arranged so deliberately on the kitchen table, the garden wall marked by evidence of recent climbing, the open back door that had never been forced. These elements combined to suggest that Eleanor Whitmore had not been taken against her will, had not wandered away in confusion, but had instead made a deliberate and calculated decision to leave Bramble Cottage and the life she had built there. A decision that must have been prompted by something of considerable significance, something that had finally overcome whatever reservations or fears had kept her in the village all these years. Saturday morning arrived with the sort of crisp clarity that autumn brings to the English countryside, and by 9 o'clock the village of Ashford-on-Thames had transformed into a hive of anxious activity that seemed utterly disproportionate to the established facts of Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance. Inspector Hartley had arrived from the county town with 2 junior officers and a demeanor that suggested he was already convinced of the tragedy that must have befallen the missing woman, and he had begun interviewing the village's residents with the systematic thoroughness of a man determined to appear thorough if not actually inspired. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room at 10:30, having prepared tea with the sort of meticulous care that suggested the visit was a social occasion rather than an official investigation, and she listened with apparent mild interest as the inspector outlined what little they had discovered during the preliminary search. Eleanor had last been seen by Timothy Foster on Wednesday afternoon at approximately 3:30, when the young man had arrived to assist with her heavier garden tasks, a weekly arrangement that had been in place for nearly 2 years, ever since Timothy's widowed mother had moved into the village, and Eleanor had taken the boy under her wing with the sort of maternal instinct that sometimes emerged in women who had become distant from their own adult children. Timothy had mentioned that Eleanor seemed distracted during his visit, that she had asked him several unusual questions about the logistics of travel to London, that she had seemed to be listening intently whenever he mentioned anything about the railway station or the timing of trains. The inspector seemed to interpret this information as evidence that Eleanor had suffered some form of mental confusion, though Miss Marple noted with interest that he did not seem to grasp the deliberate nature of Eleanor's questions, the way they suggested someone engaged in practical planning rather than random wandering. What the official investigation had not yet discovered, but what Miss Marple had already begun to understand, was that Eleanor's departure had been preceded by a visitor on Wednesday morning, someone who had called at the cottage and remained for nearly 2 hours, someone whom Eleanor's neighbors had observed, but whom no one had yet thought to identify or question. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth, who lived in the cottage opposite Bramble House and maintained a keen interest in everyone else's affairs, had mentioned to Miss Marple during the inspector's visit that she had seen someone in dark clothing arriving at Eleanor's cottage on Wednesday morning. But the woman had been vague about the visitor's identity, claiming that she had been too occupied with her own housekeeping to observe closely. It was this detail that had sparked Miss Marple's particular interest, because Mrs. Ashworth was a woman who never failed to identify any visitor to the village, a woman whose entire afternoon was often organized around observing who came and went from various households, and her sudden vagueness about this particular visitor suggested either genuine difficulty in identifying them or a deliberate choice to withhold information. By the time the inspector left her cottage, having gathered nothing of particular use, and having assured Miss Marple that they would certainly locate Eleanor once they had checked the hospitals and railway stations in the surrounding districts, Miss Marple had decided that her first course of action must be to speak privately with Mrs. Ashworth to discover precisely who had visited Eleanor on Wednesday morning and what the nature of that visit might have been. She found the woman at her kitchen window, as she had expected to do, and Mrs. Ashworth's face underwent a peculiar transformation when Miss Marple appeared at her garden gate, a shift from her usual bright nosiness to something more defensive and uncertain. The two women settled themselves in Mrs. Ashworth's parlour with cups of coffee, and it was only when they were safely ensconced in private that Mrs. Ashworth finally revealed what she had observed on Wednesday morning. The visitor had been a young woman, Mrs. Ashworth said, though she had kept her face turned away and had worn a dark coat and hat that obscured her features, and she had arrived on the early bus from the county town, carrying a small travelling bag. More significantly, she had resembled Eleanor in some indefinable way, something about the set of her shoulders or the way she moved that had struck Mrs. Ashworth as familiar, though she could not quite articulate what it was that had seemed so recognizable about a stranger. Miss Marple's hands remained perfectly still as she processed this information, though her mind was working through implications and connections with considerable urgency. A young woman who resembled Eleanor, arriving with a travelling bag, staying for 2 hours, after which Eleanor herself had apparently departed the village with deliberate planning and considerable secrecy. The possibilities that suggested themselves were numerous and troubling, each of them requiring careful consideration and investigation. It was at this precise moment that word arrived from the village constable that a body had been discovered in the pond near Miller's farm, a body that had been there long enough that preliminary identification would be difficult, but which appeared to be that of an elderly woman, still clothed in a grey cardigan and dark skirt, her grey hair floating about her face like some grotesque halo in the dark water. The village's anxiety, which had been moderate and speculative, suddenly crystallized into something far more acute and genuine, the certainty that Eleanor Whitmore had not simply disappeared, but had died, that murder or accident had claimed her, that the peaceful routine of their lives had been disrupted by genuine tragedy. Miss Marple, when she heard this news delivered by a shocked and trembling Martha Hendricks, maintained her composure with the serenity that had characterized her entire life, though her mind was working through new calculations and new possibilities, recognizing that the discovery of a body in the pond did not represent the conclusion of the mystery, but rather the beginning of something far more complex and far more troubling than anyone in the village had yet begun to imagine. The body recovered from Miller's Pond was indeed that of an elderly woman, though the water and the passage of time rendered the face sufficiently altered that official identification required dental records and the testimony of those who had known Eleanor in life, a grim process that seemed to crystallize the village's shock into something harder and more focused, a collective understanding that one of their own had been murdered, that violence and deception had infiltrated their peaceful community in a way that no one had anticipated or could easily comprehend. Inspector Hartley, whose initial theory of accidental wandering had been thoroughly demolished by the discovery of the body, suddenly transformed into a considerably more aggressive investigator, his manner becoming sharper and more suspicious, his questions taking on the tone of someone who believed that murder was rarely the work of strangers, but rather emerged from the intimate circles of family and close acquaintance. The post-mortem examination, conducted by a forensic specialist brought in from the county town, revealed that Eleanor had died from a forceful blow to the back of the skull, a wound that suggested either a fall from a considerable height onto a sharp object or a deliberate act of violence perpetrated by someone standing behind her, someone who had struck with sufficient force and accuracy to render her unconscious or dead within moments. The body had been in the water for approximately 3 days, which aligned precisely with Eleanor's Wednesday afternoon disappearance, and the clothing, though waterlogged and discolored, was confirmed to be the dress Eleanor had been wearing when Timothy Foster had last seen her alive. Within hours of this confirmation, the investigation shifted its focus dramatically, moving from the question of where Eleanor had gone to the considerably more urgent question of who had killed her and why, and Miss Marple found herself observing with considerable interest the way the village began to restructure itself around this new reality, the way suspicion began to attach itself to various individuals based on motive and opportunity, the way the careful social hierarchies that had governed Ashford-on-Thames began to fracture under the weight of accusation and doubt. The first obvious suspect, as these things so often unfolded, was Timothy Foster, The young man who had been seen with Eleanor on Wednesday afternoon, who had access to her home and her routines, and who, upon more careful questioning, admitted that Eleanor had mentioned to him that afternoon that she was expecting a visitor, that someone important to her was coming to see her, and that she seemed both anxious and somehow hopeful about this impending visit. Timothy's own account of his departure from the cottage at approximately 4 o'clock seemed straightforward enough. He had completed his assigned tasks, Eleanor had paid him his weekly wage, and he had left by the front door. Yet there remained the troubling fact that he had been one of the last people known to have seen her alive, and that he had access to information about her routines and her movements that might have been valuable to someone with murderous intent. Inspector Hartley had Timothy brought in for questioning on 3 separate occasions, each interview becoming progressively more aggressive. Yet the young man's story remained consistent and bore the marks of genuine truth, the sort of testimony that could not be shaken by repeated questioning or accusation. Miss Marple, observing Timothy during one of his visits to the village after his interviews with the police, noted the way his hands trembled slightly, the way his eyes had acquired a haunted quality, the way he seemed to have aged years in the matter of days, and she formed an assessment of his character that did not align with the profile of a young man capable of cold-blooded murder. It was Eleanor's own family that began to emerge as considerably more promising subjects of investigation, particularly her estranged son, Robert Whitmore, who lived in London and had not visited his mother in more than 5 years, and with whom Eleanor's correspondence seemed to have been sparse and occasionally strained. Robert was located and brought to Ashford-on-Thames for questioning, and he proved to be a man in his early 50s, articulate and composed, displaying the sort of emotional restraint that might have been interpreted as guilt had not his whereabouts on Wednesday afternoon been confirmed by several witnesses in London. Yet the very fact of his estrangement from his mother, the coldness that seemed to characterize their relationship, the apparent lack of affection between them, suggested to the villagers that there existed some deep rupture, some profound disagreement or disappointment that had driven a wedge between mother and son, and speculation began to flourish regarding the nature of this rift. It was at this juncture in the investigation that Miss Marple made a decision that would have seemed peculiar to anyone observing her actions without understanding her actual intentions. She requested permission from Inspector Hartley to examine the contents of Eleanor's cottage once more, ostensibly to assist the investigation by identifying any items that might have belonged to someone other than Eleanor, anything that might have been left behind by the actual murderer. The inspector, being a man who did not entirely understand the workings of Miss Marple's mind, but who had learned through years of professional courtesy to respect her insights, granted this request with minimal objection, and Miss Marple found herself alone once more in Bramble Cottage on Saturday evening as darkness fell over the village and the street. Outside grew quiet, save for the occasional murmur of villagers discussing the day's discoveries. It was then that she proceeded directly to Eleanor's bedroom, retrieved the leather-bound journal she had discovered the previous evening, and settled herself in Eleanor's reading chair with the clear intention of finally examining the contents, understanding that whatever secrets Eleanor had committed to those pages might well contain the key to understanding not only why she had died, but also the identity of the person who had deemed it necessary to take her life. Eleanor's journal, when Miss Marple finally opened it with trembling fingers that betrayed her emotional engagement despite her outward composure, revealed a woman of considerable depth and hidden suffering, a person whose carefully constructed public persona had concealed a private landscape of guilt, regret, and yearning that had shaped every decision and relationship of her adult life. The entries spanned decades, beginning in the 1920s with Eleanor's marriage to Thomas Whitmore and continuing through his death and into the long years of solitude that had followed, and what emerged from these carefully documented reflections was a narrative of profound moral complexity that cast an entirely new light upon Eleanor's character and the circumstances of her death. The central revelation, recorded in entries spanning multiple years and revisited repeatedly as Eleanor's consciousness returned again and again to the same themes, concerned the circumstances of Robert's birth, and more specifically, the identity of Robert's biological father. a truth that Eleanor had apparently carried in silence for more than 50 years, a secret that had poisoned her marriage, shaped her relationship with her son, and ultimately defined the trajectory of her entire life. Eleanor's marriage to Thomas had been childless for the first 7 years, a disappointment that had weighed upon both of them, though Thomas seemed to have borne it with greater equanimity than Eleanor herself, who had desperately wanted children, and who had experienced considerable pain at her apparent inability to conceive. Then, in 1924, Eleanor had become pregnant, and Robert had been born in the spring of 1925, and for several years Eleanor's entries reflected genuine happiness at motherhood and satisfaction with her family life. Yet beginning in 1927, the tone of the entries shifted dramatically, becoming tinged with something that could only be interpreted as desperation and self-recrimination. And Miss Marple found herself reading accounts of Eleanor's anguished attempts to conceal an affair that had taken place in 1923, before Robert's birth, an affair with a visiting artist named James Caldwell, a man who had stayed in the village for several months and who had left under circumstances that Eleanor's later entries suggested had been dramatic and emotionally traumatic. Robert, the journal made abundantly clear, was not Thomas Whitmore's biological son, but rather the product of Eleanor's liaison with James Caldwell, a truth that Eleanor had apparently confessed to Thomas at some point, leading to a crisis in their marriage that they had somehow resolved through a process of silent collusion and careful denial. An arrangement whereby Thomas had agreed to acknowledge Robert as his own son in exchange for Eleanor's complete commitment to him and her family, a promise that Eleanor appeared to have kept with religious devotion for the remainder of Thomas's life. The entries documented Eleanor's ongoing guilt, her conviction that her transgression had somehow been responsible for Thomas's early death, her belief that she had been punished for her infidelity by being forced to live a long life of quiet suffering. Watching her son grow to manhood without ever being able to reveal to him the truth of his parentage, maintaining the fiction that Robert was Thomas's biological heir and rightful inheritor of the Whitmore name and whatever modest legacy Thomas had left behind. More disturbing still were the entries from recent years, entries that documented Eleanor's growing awareness that Robert had discovered the truth, or at least begun to suspect it, and that his estrangement from his mother had been deliberately calculated, a withdrawal of affection and attention that seemed designed to punish Eleanor for some perceived transgression, though Eleanor's understanding of Robert's motivations seemed incomplete and confused. The final entry, dated Wednesday, the day of Eleanor's death, was brief and cryptic, a single paragraph that read simply, "She has come at last. After all these years, she has finally come to me. I must tell her everything, must finally unburden myself of the weight of these decades. Whatever comes after, I will face it with the knowledge that the truth, however terrible, is preferable to this endless silence. I am ready to let go of the life I have been living and step into whatever comes next. If this is my last entry, know that I do so willingly, with the understanding that some debts can only be paid through the surrender of everything one holds dear." Miss Marple sat with the journal in her lap for a long moment, her elderly face illuminated by the soft lamplight, her mind working through the implications of what she had read with the particular intensity that had characterized her entire approach to human mystery. The young woman with the traveling bag, the one whom Mrs. Ashworth had glimpsed on Wednesday morning, the one who had borne some indefinable resemblance to Eleanor herself, suddenly took on a new and more specific identity in Miss Marple's understanding. The tea-woman had almost certainly been connected to James Caldwell, Eleanor's long-ago lover, perhaps his daughter, perhaps someone descended from that relationship, someone who had sought out Eleanor after decades of separation, someone for whom Eleanor's revelations in that final conversation had held consequences far beyond mere emotional catharsis. The murder was no longer a mystery of theft or passion or the sort of ordinary human violence that erupted from trivial disagreements or momentary rage, but rather something considerably more calculated and deliberate, something that had emerged from the collision between Eleanor's desperate need for redemption and confession and someone else's need for something entirely different, something that Eleanor's final journal entry suggested she had been willing to sacrifice everything to provide. Miss Marple closed the journal carefully and returned it to its hiding place, understanding that she possessed knowledge that would profoundly alter the trajectory of the official investigation, and that she now carried a responsibility not merely to expose Eleanor's killer, but also to protect, if possible, the memory of a woman who had suffered greatly and who had finally, in her final moments, attempted to make peace with the truth of her own existence. Sunday morning dawned grey and cold, the kind of autumn weather that seemed to match the village's collective mood of unease and suspicion, and Miss Marple emerged from Bramble Cottage with the journal secured in her handbag and a carefully constructed plan forming in her mind, a plan that would require considerable delicacy and psychological acuity to execute properly. She had spent much of the night considering not merely who had killed Eleanor Whitmore, but rather why the murder had occurred in precisely the manner that it had, and the answer that had gradually crystallized in her und. Her standing suggested a scenario far more complex and far more tragic than anything the official investigation had yet begun to consider. The young woman with the travelling bag had not come to Ashford-on-Thames as Eleanor's killer, Miss Marple had concluded, but rather as someone seeking connection, seeking answers, seeking perhaps reconciliation or acknowledgement from a woman who had played a significant role in shaping circumstances that had profoundly affected her life. That this visit had ended in Eleanor's death suggested not cold-blooded premeditation, but rather a terrible accident, a collision between Eleanor's emotional fragility and someone else's desperate need, a moment of crisis that had resulted in a blow delivered in panic or rage, an act that had been neither planned nor desired but that had nonetheless occurred, leaving Eleanor dead and her visitor faced with an impossible situation requiring immediate and decisive action. The question that occupied Miss Marple's mind as she made her way through the village streets toward the church, where she intended to attend the morning service as a means of observing the community's response to Eleanor's death, was not merely the identity of the young woman, but rather the specific nature of the revelation that had prompted Eleanor's murder, the particular truth that Eleanor had possessed and that someone had deemed sufficiently dangerous to warrant Eleanor's death. What Miss Marple discovered during the course of the morning service was somewhat unexpected, though not entirely surprising given her understanding of human nature and the way that guilt manifested itself in the observable behaviors of the guilty. Robert Whitmore had arrived in the village on Saturday evening, shortly after the body's discovery and identification, and he had taken rooms at the Red Lion Inn, the village's only hotel of any consequence. He had been present at the service, sitting alone in a pew near the back, his expression carefully neutral, yet his hands had trembled slightly as he held the hymn book, and his voice had been entirely absent when the congregation had sung, a silence that suggested either profound grief or consuming anxiety. More significantly, Robert had been observed speaking in low, urgent tones with Inspector Hartley immediately following the service, and the inspector had seemed to be listening with the particular intensity that suggested he was receiving information of considerable importance. Miss Marple, recognizing an opportunity when it presented itself, arranged to encounter Robert on the path outside the church, affecting surprise at seeing him and expressing appropriate condolences for his loss, speaking in the manner of an elderly woman who had known Robert since childhood and who felt genuine sympathy for his bereavement. Robert's response to her overture had been guarded and somewhat stiff, yet there was something in his eyes that suggested he was struggling with emotions he could not entirely contain, and when Miss Marple gently mentioned that she had known his mother very well and that Eleanor had spoken of him with considerable affection and concern, something in his carefully maintained composure seemed to crack slightly. She had invited him to tea at her home, an invitation that she had phrased in such a way that it would have seemed rude and cruel for him to refuse, and Robert had accepted with the apparent reluctance of a man who understood that he might as well surrender to the inevitable, that resistance would only draw more attention to himself and raise more questions about his state of mind. It was during that tea, conducted in Miss Marple's sitting room with a sort of ritual formality that she had perfected over decades of managing difficult social situate. Ions, that Robert had finally begun to reveal the fragments of information that Miss Marple required. Eleanor, it seemed, had contacted him approximately 6 months earlier, writing a letter in which she had hinted at information she possessed about his paternity, information that she had wished to discuss with him in person but which she had been reluctant to commit to paper. Robert had ignored this letter, had refused to respond to Eleanor's subsequent attempts to communicate, had maintained the cold distance that had characterized their relationship for the preceding 5 years. Yet Eleanor's insistence had apparently worn away at his resistance, and he had finally agreed to allow Eleanor to visit him in London, though the meeting had never taken place because Eleanor had become ill and had cancelled the appointment. Then, on Wednesday, Eleanor had contacted him by telephone, a call that Robert had taken at his office, and Eleanor had informed him that someone was coming to visit her, someone connected to a secret from Eleanor's past, someone whose existence and identity had apparently been the catalyst for Eleanor's desperation to reconcile with her son. Robert had sensed in his mother's voice something approaching hysteria, a brittleness that suggested Eleanor was approaching some kind of breaking point, and he had urged her to tell him what was happening, to explain who was coming to visit her and what they might want. But Eleanor had refused to elaborate, insisting only that Robert must be prepared to learn things about his own identity that would necessarily alter his understanding of himself and his place in the world. Miss Marple, listening to this account with the focused attention of someone whose entire understanding of the crime was being reconstructed with each new piece of information, found herself asking Robert a seemingly innocent question. Had he a nigh idea who this mysterious visitor might have been, whether his mother had dropped any hints about the person's identity or their relationship to Eleanor? Robert's response, when it came, was accompanied by a physical reaction so marked that it confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions instantaneously. His hands had clenched, his jaw had tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice had been barely above a whisper, revealing that Eleanor had mentioned in the most oblique and tentative manner that the person coming to visit her might be the daughter of someone from Eleanor's past, someone who had been seeking Eleanor out in an attempt to discover the truth about her own parentage and family connections. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, the china making only the softest sound against the saucer, and she regarded Robert Whitmore with an expression of such profound compassion that he seemed to shrink beneath her gaze, as if her understanding of his situation was somehow more unbearable than ignorance would have been. She had not yet revealed to him the contents of Eleanor's journal, had not yet explained the full scope of what she had discovered, yet she understood from his reaction that Robert had himself begun to piece together certain truths about his parentage, that Eleanor's cryptic revelations had sparked a process of reconsideration and painful realization that had occupied his thoughts for the past 6 months. Robert's hands, which he had been attempting to steady by holding them flat against his thighs, began to tremble again, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the quality of a man confessing to something that had been weighing upon his conscience with considerable force. He had, he admitted, employed a private investigator to look into Eleanor's past, had commissioned this person to uncover whatever secret Eleanor had been guarding so carefully, and the investigator had discovered records suggesting that Eleanor had been involved with a man named James Caldwell in the early 1920s, before her marriage to Thomas Whitmore, and that this relationship had resulted in a pregnancy that had been carefully concealed. The investigator had further discovered that James Caldwell had left England in the summer of 1923 and had subsequently emigrated to Australia, where he had established himself in Melbourne and where he had married and fathered several children before his death in 1958. Robert had been stunned by these revelations, had struggled to accept that the man he had always believed to be his father was in fact merely the man who had raised him, that his actual biological father had been a stranger who had left England decades before Robert had even been born, and that the identity that he had carried all his life was built upon a foundation of deception and carefully constructed lies. What Robert had not yet discovered, and what Miss Marple now proceeded to reveal to him with as much gentleness as the situation allowed, was that James Caldwell had fathered at least one child during his time in Australia, a daughter born in 1926 to a woman named Margaret Caldwell, and that this daughter, had recently begun attempting to trace her father's family connections, seeking information about the English side of her heritage and the people her father had left behind when he departed for Australia. This daughter, whose name was Catherine Caldwell Morrison, had apparently traced James Caldwell's connection to Eleanor Whitmore through a combination of public records and genealogical research, and she had begun a systematic effort to locate Eleanor and to discover more about the relationship between her father and the English woman who had clearly been significant in his life. Eleanor, when Catherine had finally made contact through a carefully worded letter sent via the village post office, had apparently been both shocked and profoundly moved by the knowledge that James Caldwell had fathered a daughter, that a part of him had continued on in the world beyond his departure from England, and more significantly, that this daughter had sought Eleanor out in an attempt to understand the circumstances of her conception and the reasons for her father's departure from his English life. Miss Marple had arrived at these conclusions through a process of careful deduction and logical inference, but she now found herself facing a considerable difficulty in her investigation, because while she had identified who the mysterious visitor must have been, she had not yet determined with certainty whether Catherine Caldwell Morrison had killed Eleanor, or whether Eleanor's death had been the result of some other intervention entirely. The question of motive, however, had begun to resolve itself in Miss Marple's understanding through a consideration of what Eleanor's death might have meant to various individuals who had possessed knowledge of Eleanor's secrets, or who might have feared the revelations that Eleanor was prepared to make. Robert had admitted that upon learning of Eleanor's intention to speak with this unknown visitor, he had begun to suspect that Eleanor intended to finally reveal the truth about his parentage, not merely to him but potentially to others, that Eleanor's need for confession and redemption had overridden her lifelong commitment to maintaining the fiction that had governed her marriage and her son's identity. This possibility had apparently caused Robert considerable distress, and he had spent the past week in a state of considerable anxiety, uncertain whether Eleanor's revelations would constitute a mere personal confession, or whether they might have broader implications for his own standing in the community and his inheritance of whatever modest estate Eleanor had left behind. Yet as Miss Marple probed deeper into Robert's emotional state and his actions during the critical period surrounding Eleanor's death, she began to perceive certain inconsistencies in his account, certain gaps in his timeline, certain evasions that suggested he possessed knowledge that he had not yet revealed, knowledge that might be critically important to understanding precisely what had occurred at Bramble Cottage on Wednesday afternoon. It was at this moment, as Robert's composure began to fray under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning, that the elderly woman made a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of the investigation and that would force into the open secrets that had been carefully concealed not merely by Eleanor, but by others as well, secrets that had shaped the circumstances of Eleanor's death in ways that were only now beginning to emerge into the light of conscious understanding. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of advanced age, moving toward the window where the grey November light filtered through the lace curtains. And she began to speak in a voice so quiet that Robert was forced to lean forward to hear her, a voice that carried within it the weight of understanding accumulated across decades of observation and reflection. She had, she explained, made certain inquiries about the activities of various individuals in the village during the critical hours surrounding Eleanor's death, inquiries that had been conducted with sufficient subtlety that no one had recognized them as part of any formal investigation, yet which had nonetheless yielded information that suggested the official investigation had been proceeding along fundamentally flawed assumptions about who had access to Eleanor's cottage and who might have possessed the opportunity to commit murder. The young woman whom Mrs. Ashworth had observed arriving at Bramble Cottage on Wednesday morning had indeed been Catherine Caldwell Morrison, a woman in her late 40s, an Australian of considerable dignity and intelligence, a person who had travelled to England at considerable expense and emotional risk in order to meet the woman who had conceived her father, and to attempt to understand the circumstances that had shaped her own existence. Catherine had arrived at Eleanor's cottage at approximately 9:30 in the morning, carrying with her a portfolio of documents and photographs, evidence of her father's life in Australia, and a genuine desire to connect with her English heritage and to learn from Eleanor the truth about her father's youthful years and his decision to depart England so abruptly. The conversation between Eleanor and Catherine had apparently been emotionally intense, lasting more than 2 hours, and it had resulted in a kind of mutual recognition and understanding that had moved both women profoundly, Eleanor finally being granted the opportunity to speak openly about a part of her life that she had concealed for decades, and Catherine finally beginning to understand the circumstances of her father's departure and the reasons for his decision to sever his connections with his English past. Yet the conversation had apparently ended badly, with Catherine becoming angry about something that Eleanor had revealed, or perhaps something that Eleanor had failed to reveal, and there had been considerable tension between them as Catherine had prepared to depart the cottage. Shortly before noon, Eleanor had walked Catherine to the back door of the cottage, and it was at this juncture, according to Miss Marple's careful reconstruction of events, that some kind of confrontation had occurred, a moment of crisis that had resulted in Eleanor's death. What Miss Marple had discovered through her subtle inquiries was that Catherine had not, in fact, departed the village immediately after her visit to Eleanor's cottage, but had instead remained in Ashford-on-Thames for several additional hours, had checked into the Red Lion Inn under an assumed name, and had only departed the following morning, taking an early train from the village station to London and then onward to an airport, where she had boarded an aircraft returning to Australia. Furthermore, Miss Marple had established that Catherine had visited not merely Eleanor's cottage, but also had made inquiries about Robert Whitmore's whereabouts and movements, had apparently attempted to locate him in London, and had even travelled to his office building on Thursday morning before apparently abandoning these efforts and departing England entirely. This information, which Miss Marple now imparted to Robert, with the gentle firmness of a woman delivering news that she understood would be difficult to receive, seemed to strike Robert with considerable force, and his face paled visibly as he began to grasp the implications of what Miss Marple was suggesting. He had himself, he began to confess, received a telephone call on Thursday morning from a woman who had identified herself only as a friend of Eleanor's, a woman who had informed him that Eleanor was dead, and that he must prepare himself for a police investigation, a woman whose voice had been tight with emotion and whose words had been carefully chosen to convey information without revealing her own identity. Robert had not mentioned this telephone call to the police, he admitted, because he had been uncertain of its significance, and because he had been afraid that revealing it might complicate matters still further, might suggest connections between himself and Eleanor's death that he could not adequately explain. Miss Marple understood immediately that Catherine Caldwell Morrison had been the woman making this call, that she had deliberately ensured that Robert would be informed of Eleanor's death by someone who possessed direct knowledge of the circumstances, and that her subsequent departure from England had been calculated to place herself beyond the reach of the investigation before her identity could be firmly established. Yet the critical question remained unanswered. The question that would determine whether Catherine had killed Eleanor deliberately or whether Eleanor's death had been some form of terrible accident, a moment of violence that had occurred in the heat of emotional confrontation and that had resulted in consequences that Catherine had been forced to accept and manage in the only way available to her. Miss Marple had begun to form a hypothesis about what had actually transpired in Eleanor's cottage on that Wednesday morning. A theory that depended upon a precise understanding of human psychology and the way that desperation and revelation could collide catastrophically within the space of a small room. Yet she understood that confirmation of this hypothesis would require her to confront someone directly, to engage them in a conversation subtle enough to elicit a confession without making the person aware that they were confessing. A psychological game that demanded every ounce of her considerable skill and understanding. It was at this moment that Inspector Hartley arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with news that would redirect the investigation entirely, and that would bring into focus certain elements of the case that had previously remained obscured by the complexity of Eleanor's secrets and the careful misdirection that had characterized the aftermath of her death. Inspector Hartley's arrival at Miss Marple's cottage was announced by the sharp ring of the doorbell, followed by the constable's rather breathless declaration that they had located Catherine Caldwell Morrison in London, and that she had been detained for questioning regarding her whereabouts on Wednesday afternoon, though she had as yet refused to make any formal statement and had insisted upon her right to legal representation before submitting to anything more than preliminary questioning. The inspector, it seemed, had become aware through Miss Marple's own carefully worded suggestions to various village residents that the mysterious visitor had likely been a woman of a certain age, Australian in origin, and connected somehow to Eleanor's past, and he had begun to investigate in that direction with considerably more focus than he had previously applied to any other theory. What had brought the inspector to Miss Marple's door at this particular moment was his need for her assistance in understanding what might have motivated Catherine Caldwell Morrison to commit murder, what connection she might have had to Eleanor Whitmore beyond the vague family connections that had begun to emerge through the investigation, and whether Miss Marple possessed any insights into Catherine's state of mind or emotional condition that might explain such an apparently violent act. Miss Marple invited the inspector into her sitting room with the graciousness she extended to all visitors, regardless of their official capacity, and she found herself in the somewhat delicate position of needing to reveal information that she had discovered through means that might not withstand close scrutiny. Information that had come to her through the reading of Eleanor's private journal, without express permission from anyone in authority to do so. She had decided, however, that the time had come for complete honesty, and she proceeded to explain to Inspector Hartley the content of Eleanor's journal, the existence of James Caldwell and the illegitimate child he had fathered before his departure to Australia, and the fact that Catherine Caldwell Morrison had apparently sought Eleanor out in an attempt to understand her father's youthful years and the circumstances of her conception. The inspector's reaction to this information was initially one of skepticism, yet, as Miss Marple continued to elaborate on the connection she had discovered and the timeline of events that had preceded Eleanor's death, she observed a gradual shift in his expression, a growing recognition that he had been pursuing an investigation based upon incomplete information and that the actual motivation for Eleanor's murder lay not in any of the conventional categories of crime that he had been investigating, but rather in the far more complex arena of family secrets and emotional revelation. Yet as Miss Marple continued to speak, she found herself drawn inexorably toward a conclusion that troubled her considerably, a conclusion that seemed to emerge from the facts as she understood them, yet which carried implications that extended far beyond the simple matter of Eleanor's death. If Catherine Caldwell Morrison had killed Eleanor deliberately, the act would have required premeditation, planning, some kind of conscious decision that murdering Eleanor would serve some purpose that justified the terrible act. Yet nothing in Miss Marple's understanding of Catherine, gleaned entirely from Eleanor's journal and from the pattern of her actions in the days following Eleanor's death, suggested that Catherine possessed either the motivation or the temperament for cold-blooded murder. Catherine had sought Eleanor out in an attempt at reconciliation, in an effort to understand her own family history, in a desperate bid to connect with someone who had known her father when he was young, and Eleanor had apparently welcomed this connection with open arms, had been moved to the point of tears by the discovery that her long-ago lover had fathered a daughter who had sought Eleanor out across the years, and the vast distance separating England from Australia. So what had transformed this potentially healing encounter into a situation that had resulted in Eleanor's death? What revelation or disagreement had occurred during those 2 hours that Catherine and Eleanor had spent together that could have resulted in violence sufficiently forceful to kill an elderly woman with a single blow? Miss Marple rose from her chair once more and made her way to the bookshelf, where she had carefully placed Eleanor's journal among her collection of reference works, and she retrieved it and handed it to Inspector Hartley with the explanation that he must read it for himself, must come to understand Eleanor's perspective and the depth of emotion that had characterized her life and her relationships. As the inspector began to leaf through the journal, his expression growing progressively more troubled as he encountered entry after entry documenting Eleanor's guilt, her ear, her desperation to confess the truth about Robert's parentage, Miss Marple found herself returning to the central mystery that had begun to occupy her thoughts with increasing insistence. If Catherine had not killed Eleanor deliberately, then perhaps Eleanor's death had indeed been an accident, a terrible moment of violence that had occurred in the heat of emotional confrontation, a push or a blow delivered in panic or rage that had resulted in Eleanor falling and striking her head upon something solid and sharp, a moment of crisis that had resulted in consequences that no one had intended. Yet if that were the case, then what had Catherine done with Eleanor's body? How had Eleanor's remains come to be in Miller's Pond, a location some 2 miles from Bramble Cottage? What series of actions had Catherine undertaken in order to conceal the body and create the circumstances that would eventually lead to its discovery? Miss Marple's mind was working through these questions with the focused intensity that always preceded one of her revelations, and she found herself beginning to formulate a theory that would require her to examine not merely what had happened at Bramble Cottage on Wednesday afternoon, but also what had happened in the hours and days that had followed Eleanor's death, and who else in the village might have possessed knowledge of what had occurred and might have taken actions of their own in response to that knowledge. The turning point in Miss Marple's understanding came not from any dramatic revelation, but from a small detail that had been lurking at the periphery of her consciousness since her initial examination of Bramble Cottage, a detail so seemingly insignificant that it had been easily overlooked in the rush to identify Eleanor's murderer and establish the sequence of events that had culminated in her death. The back door of Eleanor's cottage, W. Hick, had been found standing open on Thursday morning when Timothy Foster had arrived for his weekly appointment, had not merely been left ajar, but had been deliberately propped open with a brick that had clearly been carried from the garden and positioned with conscious intention, a detail that suggested not the careless departure of someone fleeing in panic, but rather the deliberate action of someone who had needed the door to remain open for a specific purpose. Miss Marple had mentioned this observation to Inspector Hartley in passing, yet the inspector had seemed not to grasp its significance, had filed it away as merely another minor detail in the complex landscape of evidence surrounding Eleanor's death. Now, however, as Miss Marple sat in the silence that followed the inspector's departure with Eleanor's journal, she found herself returning again and again to this single detail, turning it over in her mind like a key that might unlock some hidden chamber of understanding. Eleanor's cottage sat at the end of a lane that led directly to the footpath connecting the village to Miller's farm, a path that Eleanor had walked countless times over the decades, a route that would have been entirely familiar to her, and a route that would have provided access to the pond without requiring passage through the village streets, or past any of the houses where residents might have observed such activity. If Eleanor had not been killed deliberately by Catherine Caldwell Morrison, if Eleanor's death had been the result of some terrible accident that had occurred during their emotional confrontation, then how had Eleanor's body been transported from Bramble Cottage to Miller's Pond? The answer to this question, when it finally crystallized in Miss Marple's understanding, arrived with the force of a physical blow, a sudden recognition that transformed her understanding of the entire sequence of events, and that identified as the true architect of Eleanor's death, not Catherine Caldwell Morrison, but rather someone else entirely. Someone who had possessed the opportunity and the motivation to move Eleanor's body and to conceal it where it would eventually be discovered. That someone was Timothy Foster, the young man who had left Eleanor's cottage at approximately 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, the young man who had returned to his home, and who had mentioned to his mother that Eleanor seemed distracted and anxious, the young man who had arrived at Bramble Cottage on Thursday morning to discover the back door propped open and Eleanor nowhere to be found. Timothy had access to Eleanor's cottage and to her routines. He had known about the footpath and the connection to Miller's farm, and most significantly, he had possessed knowledge of Eleanor's distressed emotional state, knowledge that would have allowed him to understand that something had occurred at the cottage that morning, something that had left Eleanor in a condition of profound agitation. Miss Marple found herself reconstructing the sequence of events with increasing certainty as the pieces began to fall into place within her understanding. Catherine and Eleanor had encountered one another at Bramble Cottage, and their conversation had become heated over some matter connected to James Caldwell, or to the circumstances of Catherine's conception, or to Eleanor's confession of the truth about Robert's parentage. A moment of violence had occurred. Perhaps Eleanor pushing Catherine away from her. Perhaps Catherine striking Eleanor in the heat of emotional confrontation, and Eleanor had fallen, striking her head upon the corner of the garden wall near the back door, a fall that had resulted in the injury that would ultimately prove fatal. Catherine, horrified and panicked, had realized that Eleanor was dead or dying, and she had made the decision to flee, to remove herself from the scene as quickly as possible, leaving the back door open in her panic as she departed through the garden toward the footpath. Yet when Timothy had arrived on Thursday morning and discovered the open door and Eleanor's absence, he had not immediately summoned the police or expressed concern to the authorities. Instead, he had taken it upon himself to investigate, to enter the cottage and determine what had happened. And in doing so, he had discovered Eleanor's body in the garden, had recognized immediately that she was dead, and had been forced to confront the terrible reality of the situation. Timothy's next action had revealed a character of considerable moral complexity and emotional confusion. Rather than immediately reporting Eleanor's death, he had made the decision to move her body, to transport it to Miller's Pond under cover of darkness, to attempt to conceal the evidence of what had occurred, apparently believing that by doing so he was protecting Catherine Caldwell Morrison from blame for Eleanor's death, protecting the reputation of Eleanor's memory, or perhaps protecting himself from involvement in the aftermath of her death. This realization struck Miss Marple with the force of genuine tragedy, for she perceived in Timothy's actions not the behavior of a murderer, but rather that of a deeply confused and emotionally vulnerable young man who had made catastrophically wrong decisions in response to a situation that had overwhelmed his capacity to think clearly. Timothy had loved Eleanor, Miss Marple understood, had developed a deep and genuine affection for her that had manifested itself in his weekly visits and his careful attention to her needs, and when he had discovered her body, he had been unable to accept that she had died, unable to accept that the woe. Aldi had so suddenly and so completely changed, and he had attempted to manage that reality through action, rather than through proper reporting to the authorities. Miss Marple's reconstruction of events had led her to a place of profound moral difficulty, for she now understood that the truth about Eleanor's death was far more complex than any simple narrative of murder could encompass, and that revealing the full truth would necessitate exposing not merely Catherine Caldwell Morrison's role in the tragedy, but also Timothy Foster's subsequent actions in attempting to conceal what had happened. She spent the remainder of Sunday in quiet reflection, considering the implications of what she had discovered and the responsibility she bore toward both justice and compassion, toward the preservation of truth and the protection of those whose actions, however misguided, had been motivated by something other than malice or premeditation. By Monday morning, Miss Marple had formulated a plan that would require considerable delicacy and psychological insight to execute, a plan that depended upon her ability to observe human reactions with the precision that had characterized her entire approach to understanding human nature, and that would ultimately place the responsibility for confession and accountability directly upon the shoulders of those who bore it. She began by requesting a meeting with Timothy Foster, arranging for him to come to her cottage on the pretext of needing assistance with some minor garden work, and when the young man arrived with his usual punctuality and pleasant demeanor, she greeted him with the warmth that had always characterized her interactions with him, yet with an undertone of understanding that immediately communicated to Timothy that his secret had been discovered. They sat in Miss Marple's sitting room with tea between them, and Miss Marple began to speak in her characteristically gentle manner about the nature of grief and desperation, about the way that young people sometimes made terrible decisions in response to overwhelming emotional circumstances, about the importance of truth even when truth carried painful consequences. Timothy's composure had crumbled almost immediately, his carefully maintained facade of normality and innocence collapsing under the weight of Miss Marple's kind but inexorable understanding. And he had finally confessed everything, detailing his discovery of Eleanor's body, his panic-stricken decision to move her remains, his nights spent awake with the terrible knowledge of what he had done, and with the growing horror of realizing that the police investigation was focusing upon the wrong person entirely. Miss Marple had listened without judgment, and when Timothy had finally fallen silent, exhausted by the weight of his confession, she had explained to him with absolute certainty that he must come forward, that he must tell the police exactly what had occurred, that only through confession and the acceptance of responsibility could he hope to achieve any measure of peace or redemption. Timothy had initially resisted, had argued that confession would destroy his life and bring shame upon his mother, yet Miss Marple had gently but firmly explained to him that remaining silent would ultimately bring far greater suffering, and that the courage required to confess was often the most important kind of courage that a person could summon. By Tuesday morning, Timothy Foster had presented himself at the police station and had made a full confession regarding his discovery of Eleanor's body and his subsequent actions in removing it from Bramble Cottage and depositing it in Miller's Pond. The inspector, upon receiving this confession, had immediately reconsidered the entire trajectory of his investigation, and he had ordered the release of Catherine Caldwell Morrison from custody, acknowledging that she was not a suspect in Eleanor's death, but rather a crucial witness whose testimony would be required to establish the actual circumstances of Eleanor's fatal injury. Catherine, when she learned that Timothy had confessed and that the truth about Eleanor's death had finally emerged, had agreed to return to England voluntarily to provide testimony, and she had revealed in careful detail the exact sequence of events that had preceded Eleanor's death. The argument that had erupted between them regarding Eleanor's intention to reveal the truth about Robert's parentage to various members of the community, the moment when Eleanor had moved toward the back door, apparently intending to walk away from the conversation, and Catherine's panicked attempt to prevent Eleanor from leaving, an attempt that had resulted in Eleanor losing her balance and falling against the garden wall. Eleanor's death had been an accident, a terrible convergence of circumstance and emotion that had resulted in tragedy. Yet it had been an accident that had only been successfully concealed through Timothy Foster's well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive actions in attempting to move and hide Eleanor's body. Inspector Hartley, facing the complex reality of a situation that defied simple categorization, had ultimately brought no charges against Timothy Foster, recognizing that the young man had acted not with murderous intent, but with profound confusion and misguided protectiveness towards someone he had cared for deeply. Catherine Caldwell Morrison had returned to Australia with a more complete understanding of her father's life and of the circumstances that had shaped his departure from England, and she had taken with her Eleanor's journal, which had been entrusted to her care as a document that properly belonged to the family history that Eleanor had helped to create. The village of Ashford-on-Thames had gradually returned to its normal rhythms, though the events surrounding Eleanor's death had left an indelible mark upon the community, a recognition that beneath the surface of quiet respectability and peaceful routine, there existed currents of emotion and complexity that could erupt at any moment with tragic consequences. Miss Marple, in the quiet of her sitting room several weeks after the conclusion of the investigation, reflected upon the nature of the tragedy that had unfolded, upon the way that secrets and shame could poison a life across decades, upon the terrible cost that silence could exact from those who bore hidden burdens. She had once again encountered the fundamental truth that had guided her entire approach to understanding human nature, that people were rarely entirely good or entirely evil, that actions were almost always more complicated than they appeared on the surface, and that compassion and understanding were often more important than judgment in navigating the moral complexities of human existence.